Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a winter you probably won't survive. Not comfortably anyway. You're in medieval England, where the cold doesn't politely knock. It kicks the door in, settles into the walls, and refuses to leave for months. Before we go any further though, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're getting settled, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a village that looks peaceful enough, thatch roofs dusted with snow, bare trees etched against a grey sky, but the calm is deceptive. Winter here is not a season, it's a trial. Blizzards roll in from the North Sea, driven by winds that cut through wool and skin alike. There's no forecast, no warning siren, no comforting glow of radiators waiting indoors. The cold simply arrives, and you either adapt or fade quietly into the background of history. One hard fact you quickly learn is that medieval England, particularly between the 13th and early 15th centuries, experienced colder average temperatures than today, especially during what scholars later called the early phases of the Little Ice Age. Rivers froze more often, harvests failed more regularly, and snowstorms lingered for days instead of hours. Chroniclers mention winters so harsh that birds reportedly fell frozen from the sky. Likely exaggerated, but revealing of how terrifying these conditions felt to people living through them. You feel that fear now. The cold isn't just uncomfortable, it's invasive. It creeps into your fingers, your jaw, your thoughts. You notice how everyone around you seems perpetually tense, always measuring daylight, always glancing at the sky. Winter dictates the rhythm of life here. You don't ask whether a storm is coming, you ask when and how bad. There's a strange, almost grim humour to how people talk about it. You hear villagers joke that winter separates the strong from the dead, and you're not entirely sure it's a joke. Survival isn't heroic or dramatic, it's quiet, repetitive and deeply exhausting. You wake up cold, work cold, eat cold food that barely warms you, and go to sleep cold again. Comfort is not the goal. Endurance is. One quirky detail you might not expect. People believed snow itself could be a kind of omen. Heavy snowfall early in winter was sometimes seen as a blessing, insulating crops like a blanket. Other times, the same snow was blamed for angering God or stirring malevolent spirits. There's no single explanation, just a swirl of folklore layered over lived experience, trying to make sense of suffering that feels random and unfair. Scholars still debate how much of medieval winter mortality was caused directly by cold versus indirectly by what cold triggered: malnutrition, weakened immune systems, and disease spreading in cramped, sealed homes. You can feel how interconnected it all is. The blizzard outside isn't just weather, it's a chain reaction. Roads disappear, trade stops, food runs low, and bodies already running on the edge simply can't keep up. You start to understand that survival begins long before the first snowflake falls. Everything you see, how homes are clustered, how fields are managed, how food is stored, is shaped by the knowledge that winter will come, and it will not be kind. There's no romantic notion of snowy evenings here. Snow means silence, isolation, and the real possibility that no help is coming if something goes wrong. As night settles in, the darkness feels heavier than it should. Candles are expensive and firewood is precious, so light is rationed. You sit with that darkness, listening to the wind scrape against walls and roofs. The sound is constant, like the land itself breathing. It's oddly hypnotic, but also deeply unsettling. Sleep, you realise, is both an escape and a risk. People do not always wake up. Yet life continues, stubbornly. Children are born in winter. Stories are told. Bread is baked when there's flour to spare. You sense a kind of hardened resilience. Not optimism exactly, but acceptance. Winter is not an enemy to be defeated. It's a force to be endured, negotiated with, survived one night at a time. And as the blizzard outside begins to howl louder, you're only just beginning to understand how medieval people faced it, without heating, without certainty, and without the safety nets you're used to. This is the cold coming for England, and for you. You step indoors, expecting relief, and instead discover that medieval houses don't so much defeat the cold as negotiate with it. The structure around you is low and squat, pressed close to the earth as if trying to hide from the wind. Ceilings are low, doorways narrow, windows tiny and few. This isn't accidental. Every inch of space above your head is another pocket where heat could escape. So medieval builders compress life downward, closer to the ground, closer to whatever warmth can be coaxed into existence. The walls are thick, sometimes over a metre deep, packed with wattle and daub or rough stone. You run your hand along the surface and feel how uneven it is, how solid. This thickness slows heat loss, acting like a crude thermal battery. During the day, if there is a fire, the walls absorb some warmth. At night, they release it back into the room, just enough to keep the cold from becoming lethal. One solid historical fact is that many medieval peasant homes were designed with a single multi-purpose room precisely to concentrate heat and bodies together, reducing exposure and fuel use. You notice how little glass there is. Real glass is expensive, so windows are often covered with oiled cloth, horn panels or nothing at all, sealed with wooden shutters when storms arrive. Light is sacrificed for warmth. Fresh air is a luxury that winter doesn't allow. Smoke lingers, eyes sting, lungs burn slightly, but that smoke is also proof that there's a fire somewhere, however small. The roof above you is thatch, layers of straw or reeds packed thick enough to shed rain and snow while trapping air. Snow piling on top actually helps, forming an insulating layer that muffles sound and cold alike. It's a strange thought that the very blizzard threatening your survival also adds a thin layer of protection. This leads to one of those medieval contradictions where danger and safety blur together, and people learn to live inside the tension. Furniture is sparse, not for aesthetic reasons, but because open space wastes heat. Chests line the walls, doubling as storage and wind buffers. Tapestries or rough cloth hangings are nailed up, not for decoration, but to block drafts creeping through stone. Even the floor plays a role. Dirt floors, sometimes covered with rushes or straw, insulate better than bare stone and feel less brutally cold underfoot. A quirky detail you might not expect is that some homes intentionally had crooked layouts, angled walls or offset doors, not because builders lacked skill, but because straight corridors created wind tunnels. A poorly placed door could turn a house into a freezing funnel during a storm, so houses grow organically, awkwardly, shaped by generations of trial and error rather than neat planning. You begin to understand that these homes are not designed for comfort as you define it. They are designed for survival with minimal resources. Firewood is hard to gather in winter, peat has to be cut months in advance, and charcoal is precious. So houses are built to stretch every ember as far as possible. You don't heat rooms, you heat people. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how effective these designs truly were. Some historians argue that medieval homes were shockingly cold by modern standards, barely above freezing during severe winters. Others suggest that constant exposure led to physiological adaptation. People simply functioned better in cold environments, because their bodies were accustomed to it. You feel caught between these arguments as you sit there, teeth clenched, fingers numb, wondering how anyone could adapt to this without slowly breaking down. The social structure of housing also matters. You're rarely alone. Extended families, servants, even unrelated labourers often share space. Privacy is exchanged for warmth. Bodies are heat sources, and clustering together at night can mean the difference between life and death. From your modern perspective, it feels crowded, invasive. But here, isolation is far more dangerous than inconvenience. As the wind rattles the shutters, you realise how quiet everything else is. Sound doesn't travel far in snow, and thick walls swallow what remains. The world shrinks to the crackle of a fire, the occasional cough, the sigh of someone shifting on a bench. This inward focus shapes winter psychology. Life becomes smaller, slower, more inward-facing, both physically and mentally. Another hard truth settles in. These houses are also fire traps. With open hearths, wooden beams, and thatch overhead, a single spark can erase an entire household in minutes. Yet people accept the risk, because cold kills more reliably than fire. It's a grim calculation, made unconsciously every winter. You sit there, wrapped in rough wool, watching smoke curl toward the roof where it escapes through a simple hole. There is no chimney yet, not in most homes. Chimneys will come later, transforming domestic life. But for now, smoke-stained rafters and blackened walls are the price of warmth. By the time night deepens, you understand something essential. Medieval survival isn't about mastering nature. It's about shaping yourself and your surroundings just enough to endure it. These homes are not shelters from winter, they are compromises with it. and as the blizzard presses harder against the walls, you feel how fragile that compromise really is. You quickly learn that the phrase life without heating is misleading, because heat exists here. It's just intensely personal. There is no expectation that a building should be warm. That idea hasn't been invented yet. Instead, warmth is something you earn, guard, and physically cling to. You heat your hands, your feet, your core. The room around you can stay cold. It's your body that matters. You start with posture. People hunch, curl, tuck themselves inward, instinctively reducing surface area. You see it everywhere once you notice it. Shoulders rolled forward, arms folded inside sleeves, heads bowed not in humility but in conservation. Standing still is dangerous. Movement, even small repetitive tasks, keeps blood flowing. This is one historical reality often overlooked. Medieval daily life involved near constant motion in winter, not productivity, but survival-driven circulation. There's a solid fact behind this behaviour. Without sustained ambient heat, hypothermia becomes a real risk even indoors, especially during prolonged cold snaps. Medieval medical texts didn't understand hypothermia as you do, but they recognised deadly chills and advised motion, warm foods, and bodily contact as treatment. You're living that advice now, even if no one explains it to you. You notice how people cluster near the hearth, not evenly spaced, but layered. The closest seats are prized, often reserved for elders, children, or whoever tends the fire. Everyone else forms rings outward, like human insulation. If you're unlucky, you sit near the door, where every opening lets winter punch its way inside. Doors here are thick, but they're opened often, and each time the room exhales warmth it can't afford to lose. A quirky detail that feels almost unbelievable at first is the use of heated stones or bricks. These are warmed in the fire, wrapped in cloth, and placed under benches, inside beds, or even tucked beneath clothing. It's not uncommon to see someone cradle a stone like a pet, shifting it from lap to feet and back again. It's crude, inefficient, and surprisingly effective, for a while. Of course, stones cool quickly, and reheating them uses fuel, so even this small comfort is rationed. Nighttime is the real test. You strip down layers not to cool off, but to manage moisture. Sweat is dangerous in winter. Damp clothing steals heat rapidly. So people change into dry night garments, even if they're thin, trusting shared warmth and insulation to do the rest. This practice shows a level of environmental awareness that contradicts the idea of medieval people being ignorant or careless. They may lack technology, but they understand their bodies intimately. There's debate among historians about just how cold indoor temperatures dropped during severe winters. Some reconstructions suggest interiors hovering just above freezing. Others argue that constant fires, body heat, and insulation kept temperatures higher than we imagine. Sitting here, you suspect both are true, depending on wealth, fuel access, and weather severity. There's no single medieval winter experience, only gradients of cold. Social hierarchy plays out thermally. The closer you are to power, the warmer you are. Lords and wealthy merchants have private chambers, multiple hearths, and better fuel. They still endure cold, but it's muted, softened. You, on the other hand, learn to accept numbness as a baseline state. Fingers don't always fully respond. Toes exist mostly as abstract concepts. Another historical fact settles in quietly. Alcohol is not used the way you might expect. While ale and mead are common, people know, through experience not science, that drunkenness makes cold more dangerous. Alcohol creates a false sense of warmth while increasing heat loss. So winter drinking tends to be steady but restrained, more about calories and morale than escape. You also begin to understand how heat shapes time. Days shorten not just because of daylight, but because cold limits what you can do. Fine tasks become harder with stiff fingers. Tools slip, mistakes increase. So winter work favours repetition and strength over precision. Spinning, mending, food preparation, tasks that can be paused to warm hands, take priority. The psychological effect is subtle but powerful. Cold demands attention. It keeps you in your body, in the present moment. Long-term planning fades. You think in terms of hours, not weeks. Will the fire last until morning? Will the wind die down? Will everyone wake up? This narrowed focus becomes a mental survival strategy, conserving emotional energy the same way you conserve heat. There's also a fringe belief that cold itself could be medicinal if endured correctly. Some medieval thinkers believed controlled exposure toughened the body, making it more resilient. Others warned that cold invited imbalance in the humours, particularly excess phlegm. You feel caught between these theories, your body craving warmth while your mind tells you endurance is expected, even virtuous. You watch someone rub their hands vigorously, then press them against another person's back, sharing warmth without comment. There's no embarrassment in this. Cold strips away certain social barriers. Warmth becomes communal property. This intimacy isn't romanticised, it's practical, almost transactional. You give heat, you receive heat, and everyone survives another hour. As the fire burns low and no one rushes to rebuild it, you realise something essential. Medieval life without heating is not about defeating cold. It's about managing loss of heat, of energy, of comfort, carefully enough that life continues. You don't chase warmth, you ration it. And in doing so, you begin to feel how winter reshapes not just bodies, but expectations themselves. You're drawn inevitably toward the hearth, because everything in medieval domestic life bends around it. This is not a fireplace in the modern sense, it's an open hearth, often nothing more than a shallow stone-lined pit in the centre of the room. Smoke rises freely, curling up toward a hole in the roof, staining beams black over generations. Your eyes sting, your throat tightens, but the fire is life itself. Without it, winter would end this household in days. Historically, the hearth is more than a heat source. It's the centre of cooking, light, social order, and ritual. Legal documents from medieval England even define a household by the presence of a hearth. If you had one, you existed in the eyes of the state. Sitting here, you feel why. The fire draws people in, creates a shared orbit, and silently dictates who belongs where. You notice how carefully the fire is managed. No roaring flames, no wasted sparks. Fuel is fed slowly, deliberately. A log is turned just so, coaxed rather than consumed. This is because firewood is precious, especially during a blizzard. Forests are not endless, and access can be restricted by law or weather. One hard fact is that by the late medieval period, many English regions faced wood shortages, pushing people to rely increasingly on peat or charcoal. A quirky, almost unsettling detail is how people read the fire, the way flames flicker, how smoke behaves, whether embers glow or dim. These signs are interpreted as omens. A fire that sputters might signal illness. A sudden flare could mean news is coming. You don't know whether anyone truly believes this or if it's a psychological coping mechanism, but in a world this uncertain, patterns offer comfort. You also learn that the hearth is dangerous in ways you can't ignore. Sparks leap unexpectedly. Clothing catches. Children fall. There are no fire guards, no alarms. Scars from burns are common, worn with the same resignation as missing teeth. Yet no one questions the risk. Fire is unpredictable, but cold is relentless. Between the two, fire is the gamble people are willing to take. At night, the fire is often banked rather than extinguished. Ash is piled over embers, smothering them into a slow, glowing core that can be revived by morning. This technique, documented in medieval household manuals, saves fuel and ensures continuity. Waking to a dead hearth is a minor crisis. Reviving a sleeping one feels like a small miracle. Scholars debate how central the hearth truly was to warmth versus its symbolic importance. Some argue that its actual heat output was limited, especially in drafty homes. Others suggest that psychological warmth, the sense of safety and normalcy it provided, was just as crucial as physical heat. Sitting here, you suspect the distinction doesn't matter. When everything outside is hostile, a shared flame becomes a kind of emotional anchor. The hearth also organises sleep. People arrange bedding around it in loose circles, prioritising proximity. There are no strict bedtime rituals. Sleep comes in stretches, interrupted by the need to tend the fire, feed a child, or simply shift position to regain feeling in a limb. You learn to sleep lightly, always half aware of the fire's state. You hear stories passed in the firelight, tales of winters past, of storms that buried villages, of people who didn't make it through. These stories aren't meant to scare, they're instructional, cautionary. Remember to store fuel high and dry. Never let the fire go out completely. If snow seals the door, wait before digging out. Experience is passed orally, flame-lit and unrecorded, there's a subtle hierarchy even here. The person who controls the fire wields quiet power. They decide when to add fuel, when to let it fade, when it's safe to sleep. Often this is the oldest capable member of the household, someone trusted with judgment. Fire management is not a menial task, it's a responsibility. Another fringe belief lingers in the background, that fire itself has a spirit. Letting it die is seen by some as inviting misfortune. New fires are sometimes kindled from old ones to preserve continuity. You don't know how widespread this belief is, but you feel the reverence in how people treat the hearth, how they speak softly around it. As the blizzard rages outside, the fire becomes a boundary between life and death, measured not in walls or doors, but in glowing embers and shared vigilance. You realise that medieval survival during deadly blizzards is not about grand strategies. It's about small, repeated acts of care, turning a log, banking ash, staying awake just a little longer, until morning comes, and then doing it all again. When night finally pulls you away from the hearth, you discover that medieval beds are not about comfort in the modern sense. They are survival devices. You don't undress to sleep, you layer. Shirts, tunics, stockings, sometimes even caps stay on. Fabric is insulation, and every layer matters. Beds here are less like furniture and more like carefully constructed nests meant to trap heat and keep it from escaping until morning. A solid historical fact quickly becomes clear. Mattresses are often stuffed with straw, chaff, or dried leaves, materials chosen not for softness, but for their ability to hold air. Air, trapped and still, is warmth. Feathers are a luxury reserved for the wealthy, and even then they're carefully protected from moisture. You can feel how the mattress lifts you slightly off the frozen ground, breaking the direct path for cold to seep into your bones. Above you, blankets pile up, wool on wool, sometimes layered with rough linen. These blankets are heavy, pressing down with a weight that feels both comforting and restrictive. The pressure itself reduces airflow, helping retain warmth. You shift slowly, because once the heat pocket forms, breaking it feels like inviting winter back inside. One quirky and surprisingly widespread practice is bed sharing. Entire families sleep together, not out of sentimentality but thermodynamics. Bodies generate heat, and clustered together, that heat accumulates. Privacy dissolves in winter. You sleep shoulder to shoulder, feet tangled, breath shared. It's awkward, occasionally irritating, but undeniably effective. Even unrelated household members may share bedding during extreme cold. There's scholarly debate over whether this constant closeness increased disease transmission during winter months. Some argue that cramped sleeping conditions worsened respiratory illnesses. Others counter that cold and malnutrition were the primary culprits, and that warmth from shared beds may have actually improved survival rates. Lying here, pressed against others, you understand how theoretical that debate feels when the alternative is freezing alone. Children are placed in the warmest positions, often in the middle, shielded by adults on either side. Elders, too, are protected, their slower circulation making them especially vulnerable. You sense a quiet prioritization of life stages, an unspoken agreement about who needs warmth most. It's not sentimental, it's practical, rooted in hard experience. You also learn that sleep is fragmented. People wake repeatedly through the night, shifting, checking on the fire's glow through the darkness, listening for changes in the wind. Deep, uninterrupted sleep is rare in winter. Instead, rest comes in layers, just like clothing. Thin, cumulative, barely sufficient. A fringe belief whispers through the room that sleep itself is dangerous in extreme cold. There are warnings about sleeping into death, a fear that if you let yourself relax too deeply, your body will simply stop fighting. Whether this is medically accurate or not, it shapes behaviour. People resist sinking fully into sleep, keeping part of themselves alert, half awake until dawn. Caps and scarves are worn in bed, covering head and neck where heat escapes fastest. This detail surprises you, but it makes sense. Medieval people may not know the science, but they know the result. You feel the difference immediately when you pull fabric over your ears, how the cold recedes just enough to make rest possible. The bed itself is often enclosed. Curtains hang from wooden frames, creating a small microclimate around the sleepers. These bed curtains block drafts and trap body heat, turning the bed into a room within a room. Among the wealthier classes, this practice becomes common, but even simple households improvise with cloth hung from pegs or beams. You hear the wind howl outside, but it feels distant now, muted by layers of wool, straw, and human presence. The smell of smoke clings to everything: hair, blankets, breath. But it's familiar, even comforting. Smoke means fire, and fire means survival. Another historical truth settles in: waking alive is not guaranteed. Winter mortality is a known reality. Some mornings, someone doesn't stir. This knowledge hangs silently over the room, not spoken, but felt. It makes the warmth you do have feel fragile, precious. As you lie there, breathing slowly, matching the rhythm of those around you, you realise that medieval sleep during deadly blizzards is not about rest. It's about persistence. Each night is a negotiation with cold, struck again and again until spring returns. And as exhaustion finally pulls you under, you understand that surviving winter here is as much about how you sleep as how you live. Morning arrives without warmth. You wake not because you're rested, but because your body refuses to stay still any longer. Fingers ache, joints protest, and breath fogs the air inside the house. Before you even think about food or work, you think about clothing. What you wear today will decide how much cold you can tolerate and how long you can function. Medieval clothing is a system, not an outfit. The foundation is linen, shirts and undergarments worn next to the skin. Linen absorbs moisture, pulling sweat away so it doesn't chill you later. This is a hard historical fact supported by surviving garments and household accounts. Wool goes on top, layer after layer, because wool retains heat even when damp. Fur, if you're fortunate enough to have it, is the outermost barrier, breaking the wind like living armour. You pull on hose that cling tightly to your legs, minimising air gaps. Over them goes a tunic, then perhaps a surcoat or cloak. Belts cinch fabric close to the body, preventing heat from escaping upward. Nothing hangs loose without reason. Every fold, every tie, serves a thermal purpose. Fashion bends to weather in ways you can feel immediately. A quirky detail emerges as you watch people dress. Clothing is often slept in, or at least kept close, so it doesn't freeze overnight. A frozen tunic is a serious problem. Putting it on can drain heat rapidly, undoing whatever warmth you built during sleep. So garments are tucked under blankets, hung near the hearth, or even used as pillows to keep them pliable. Colour matters less than texture. Darker fabrics absorb slightly more heat from firelight and weak winter sun, a fact people may not articulate scientifically, but seem to understand instinctively. You notice how rare bright colours become in winter among common folk, not just because dyes are expensive, but because practicality dominates. There's debate among historians about how effective medieval winter clothing truly was. Some argue that even with layers, exposure was constant and severe. Others point to archaeological finds showing surprisingly sophisticated tailoring designed to seal in warmth. Wearing these clothes now, you suspect both sides are right. The garments help, undeniably, but they are heavy, restrictive, and only just sufficient. Head coverings are non-negotiable. Caps, hoods, and coifs stay on indoors and out. Heat escapes rapidly from the head, and medieval people know this from experience. Remove a hood, and the cold floods in almost instantly. You feel it the moment you adjust yours, a sharp reminder of how thin the margin is. Hands are another challenge. Gloves exist, but they limit dexterity, so people often work bare-handed, warming fingers frequently near the fire or against their own bodies. You see someone blow into their hands, then tuck them briefly under their arms before returning to work. It's a constant rhythm. Work, warm, work again. Footwear is thick but imperfect. Leather shoes, sometimes lined with wool, keep snow out but not cold. Straw or cloth is stuffed inside for extra insulation. Wet feet are dangerous, so drying shoes near the fire is a daily ritual, even though it risks warping the leather. Survival always involves trade-offs. A fringe belief surfaces around clothing and morality. Excessive layering is sometimes criticised as indulgent, even sinful, especially by religious authorities preaching endurance. Yet when blizzards hit, doctrine bends. Staying alive outranks spiritual austerity no matter what sermons suggest. You step outside briefly and feel the wind test every seam, every weak point. The cold finds gaps instantly. You understand now why cloaks are wrapped tight and pinned securely, why people move with deliberate efficiency. There is no casual exposure. Every moment outdoors is calculated. Clothing also signals status in winter. Those with better fabric, thicker cloaks, and access to fur clearly suffer less. The inequality is visible, tangible. Cold does not strike evenly. It punishes poverty with particular cruelty. As you head back inside, snow clinging to your hem, you realise medieval winter survival is stitched together one layer at a time. These clothes don't make you warm, they make you less cold. And in a world of deadly blizzards and no heating, that small difference is everything. Cold burns calories, and medieval people know this without needing charts or theories. You feel it in your own body, the constant hunger that gnaws even when you haven't worked hard. Winter food is not about pleasure or variety, it's about density. Every bite has to justify the fuel spent preparing it, and the energy it provides in return. One solid historical fact anchors this reality. Medieval winter diets in England rely heavily on preserved foods. Fresh produce is rare once frosts settle in. What you eat now was slaughtered, dried, salted, smoked or pickled months ago. Meat comes out tough and briny, requiring long cooking to make it edible. The fire that cooks it also warms the room, so meals are timed to serve both purposes at once. You're handed a bowl of thick pottage, grains, legumes, maybe a bit of fat or meat if you're lucky. It's bland, heavy, and strangely satisfying. The warmth spreads slowly from your stomach, a core heat that lingers longer than anything the fire can provide. Medieval people may not know metabolism, but they understand that hot, heavy food keeps you going longer than thin fare. A quirky detail surfaces when you notice how often fat appears in winter meals. Drippings are saved obsessively, lard is prized. Butter, if available, is used generously. Fat is heat insurance. It burns slowly, sustaining warmth hours after eating. In lean years, the absence of fat is felt immediately, not just in taste, but in endurance. Bread remains the staple, darker and denser than what you're used to. Made from rye or barley rather than wheat, it provides steady energy. Stale bread is soaked in broth or ale to soften it, creating another warm, filling dish. Nothing is wasted, especially not in winter. There's debate among scholars about whether medieval people were chronically undernourished or simply adapted to lower caloric intake. Winter complicates this question. In good years, stored food carries households through. In bad years, blizzards cut off supply lines, grind grain mills to a halt, and make hunger a constant companion. Sitting here, scraping the bottom of a bowl, you feel how thin the line is. Food timing matters. The largest meal often comes in the middle of the day, when there's light and the fire is already burning. Eating late at night risks wasting fuel or sleeping on a cold stomach. You feel the logic immediately. Hunger at bedtime is dangerous. It drains warmth faster than sleep can restore it. Alcohol plays a complicated role. Ale is consumed daily, safer than water and full of calories. In winter, it's slightly warmed, not enough to intoxicate, but enough to take the edge off the cold. There's a folk understanding that too much drink makes you careless, more likely to fall asleep in unsafe conditions. Moderation is survival. A fringe belief lingers that certain foods possess warming or cooling qualities beyond their temperature. Spices, rare and expensive, are considered warming and medicinal. Most people can't afford them, but onions, garlic and leeks fill a similar symbolic role. You eat them not just for nutrition, but for perceived protection against winter illness. Meals are communal, reinforcing survival through shared resources. Eating alone is rare and discouraged. You notice how bowls are passed, portions adjusted without discussion. If someone is weaker, they're fed first. This is not altruism, it's strategy. A sick person in winter becomes everyone's problem. The smell of food fills the room, heavy and comforting, blending with smoke and damp wool. For a brief moment the cold recedes. These moments matter. They break the monotony, anchor the day, and remind you that survival isn't just about enduring, it's about sustaining morale. As you finish eating, you feel heavier, slower, warmer. The fire crackles low, already being banked for the next task. You understand now that medieval winter survival is fueled as much by calories as by courage. In deadly blizzards, food doesn't just keep you alive, it keeps the cold from winning. When the blizzard truly settles in, movement becomes the enemy. Snow piles high enough to erase paths, roads, and boundaries between fields. What was once familiar terrain turns into a blank, hostile surface. You step outside and immediately feel how sound disappears, swallowed by drifting white. The world shrinks to a few cautious steps in any direction. One hard historical fact defines this moment. Medieval roads are poorly maintained even in good weather. In winter they vanish entirely. Snow fills ruts, hides ditches and levels hedges. Travellers lose direction easily, and without landmarks, even short journeys become deadly. Chroniclers record people freezing within sight of their own villages, disoriented and exhausted. You watch as doors are blocked deliberately with snow and straw, not to keep people out, but to keep warmth in. Snow becomes a building material, banked against walls to insulate them from the wind. It feels counterintuitive, but you can sense how the air inside grows slightly calmer once the drafts are sealed. The blizzard outside becomes part of the structure's defence. A quirky detail surfaces in how people mark their homes. Poles, bundles of brush, or strips of cloth are tied near doorways, rising above the snow so entrances can be found again. Without them, doors disappear, and digging blindly wastes precious energy. You realise how easily someone could be trapped inside or out by a single night of heavy snowfall. Inside, time stretches. Work that requires travel stops entirely. Fields are inaccessible, markets unreachable. Winter tasks shrink to what can be done indoors: mending, tool repair, storytelling, prayer. Idleness is not laziness here. It's conservation. Every unnecessary movement risks injury or heat loss. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how isolated medieval communities truly were during severe winters. Some argue that villages were effectively cut off for weeks, even months. Others suggest limited travel continued through local knowledge and sheer necessity. Watching the snow stack higher, you suspect isolation varies wildly depending on geography and luck. For some, winter is an inconvenience. For others, it's a siege. You hear about people attempting to travel anyway. Messengers, traders, those desperate for help. These stories rarely end well. Frostbite claims fingers and toes, sometimes entire limbs. Medical texts from the period describe blackened flesh and slow decay, though without understanding infection. You don't need theory to grasp the horror. You've seen numbness creep in fast enough. A fringe belief emerges that blizzards are tests sent by God, separating the faithful from the careless. Survival becomes moralized. Those who perish are sometimes described as having lacked foresight or discipline. This belief offers comfort to survivors but adds a layer of judgment to tragedy. You feel how dangerous that mindset can be. Inside the house, air grows stale as openings are sealed, coughs spread, eyes water from smoke that has nowhere to go. Yet opening a shutter is unthinkable. Fresh air is sacrificed to warmth. You feel the trade-off in your lungs, understanding how winter sickness thrives in these conditions. People listen constantly. Wind direction, roof creaks, the muffled collapse of distant structures, all carry meaning. A sudden silence can be more alarming than noise. Snow pressing too heavily can bring roofs down. You see someone knock snow free from the thatch with a pole, risking exposure to prevent catastrophe. Night falls early, but sleep comes reluctantly. The storm roars like a living thing, battering walls, probing for weakness. You feel small inside it, aware that if this house fails, there is nowhere else to go. No rescue will arrive until the storm ends, if it ends. Yet morning comes, pale and uncertain. The blizzard has reshaped the world, but life continues. Doors are dug out. Fires are revived. The routine resumes, altered but intact. You realise that medieval survival during deadly blizzards depends not on bravery, but on patience, on knowing when not to move, when to wait, and when to endure the snow's long, silent siege. When isolation deepens, survival stops being an individual problem and becomes a communal one. You feel this shift almost immediately. Doors open more often despite the cold, not out of carelessness, but necessity. People check on one another, counting faces, listening for coughs, watching for signs that someone hasn't been seen in too long. In winter, absence is alarming. One historical fact becomes clear as you observe this rhythm. Medieval villages are tightly interdependent. No household is truly self-sufficient, especially during severe weather. Grain stores, fuel, tools and labour are distributed unevenly, and blizzards expose those gaps brutally. Survival depends on whether neighbours step in before weakness turns fatal. You notice how help is offered without ceremony. A bundle of firewood appears by a door, a pot of pottage is shared. Someone stronger takes on the task of clearing snow for multiple households in one exhausting effort. There's no accounting, no immediate expectation of repayment. Winter debt is remembered, but it's settled later, when survival is no longer at stake. A quirky detail surfaces in how information spreads. There's no written notice, no announcements, just word of mouth carried door to door. Who has fuel left? Who is ill? Who lost a roof beam to snow weight? This network of whispered updates becomes as vital as food. Knowing where help is needed prevents quiet deaths. You also sense the limits of this system. Charity is not endless. If a winter drags on too long, even generous households begin to ration help. This tension sits just beneath the surface, unspoken but felt. Community saves lives, but it is strained by prolonged scarcity. There's scholarly debate about how cohesive medieval villages truly were. Some historians argue that harsh conditions fostered strong mutual aid. Others point to records of conflict, theft, and abandonment during famines and severe winters. Standing here, you realize both are true. Solidarity and selfishness coexist, each rising or falling depending on fear and resources. The church plays a role in this winter network. You see it less as a spiritual authority and more as a logistical anchor. Churches store grain, offer shelter, and serve as gathering points when storms break. Bells ring not just for prayer, but to signal danger or summon help. In blizzards, the sound of bells cutting through snow can mean the difference between finding shelter and wandering until exhaustion wins. A fringe belief weaves through these acts of aid, that charity in winter carries extra spiritual weight. Helping someone survive the cold is seen as a direct investment in one's own salvation. Whether or not this belief is sincere, it motivates action when energy is scarce. Morality becomes a resource, spent carefully like fuel. You witness how disputes are temporarily suspended. Boundary arguments, debts, old grudges, winter presses pause on them, not because forgiveness has bloomed, but because conflict wastes energy. Survival demands focus. You sense how spring will bring reckoning, but winter demands truce. Children become messengers, slipping through snowbanks where adults struggle. Their small size and agility make them valuable, though the risk is terrifying. You watch one sent to check on an elderly widow, returning breathless but triumphant. The relief in the adults' faces tells you how close loss always feels. Illness complicates everything. When someone falls sick, care becomes a communal burden. Someone must bring food, tend fires, sit through the night. Yet sickness is feared. Prolonged closeness risks spreading whatever illness has taken hold. You see the careful balance, help given quickly, efficiently, with minimal exposure. It's compassion shaped by necessity. You also notice exclusion. Strangers, travellers, the very poor, those without strong ties, fare worse. Community has edges, and winter sharpens them. Hospitality exists, but it's cautious. Taking in the wrong person could doom a household. This reality is uncomfortable, but undeniable. As days blur together, you feel how community creates a rhythm that replaces lost routines. Shared tasks, shared meals, shared watchfulness. Even grief is shared, spoken quietly so it doesn't consume too much warmth. There's no room for dramatic mourning. Bodies are wrapped, stored if the ground is frozen, and life continues. When the storm finally eases, you step outside and see the village altered but intact. Smoke rises from multiple roofs. People move slowly but purposefully. Survival has not been elegant or fair, but it has been collective. You understand now that medieval endurance during deadly blizzards isn't built on individual toughness. It's built on proximity, physical, social, moral. Alone, you would not last long here. Together, barely you might. And that fragile togetherness is what carries people through the long, white silence of winter. When the cold becomes overwhelming, you're drawn toward the one building in the village that was never meant to be private, the church. In winter, it transforms from a place of worship into a refuge of last resort. Its stone walls are thick, its roof sturdy, and its presence reassuring. Even before you step inside, you feel the gravity it holds over the community during deadly blizzards. A clear historical fact anchors this role. Medieval churches in England often functioned as emergency shelters during extreme weather. Records and local traditions describe villagers gathering inside during storms, especially those whose homes were damaged or too exposed. The church is not warm by modern standards, far from it. but it is stable, enclosed, and communal. Inside, the cold feels different. Stone holds chill the way it holds silence. Yet the space is vast enough to accommodate many bodies, and bodies are heat. People cluster together in pews or on the floor, wrapped in cloaks and blankets. Candles flicker, expensive and carefully rationed, casting small islands of light that feel almost sacred in the darkness. A quirky detail you notice is how breath fog hangs longer here, drifting upward like incense. Some people interpret this as a sign of prayers rising, a poetic merging of physical survival and spiritual hope. Whether believed or not, the imagery comforts those who have little else to cling to. Churches also offer organisation. Clergy coordinate food distribution, assign spaces, and mediate tensions. In blizzards, authority becomes practical rather than theological. You see disputes over space or supplies settle quickly, not by scripture, but by urgency. Survival overrides doctrine. There's ongoing scholarly debate about how welcoming churches truly were to everyone. Some historians argue that the poor and landless were always given shelter. Others suggest access depended heavily on local leadership and resources. Sitting here among coughing bodies and damp cloaks, you suspect generosity was real, but finite. Stone walls don't create food or fuel. Another historical truth settles in quietly. Churches are some of the few buildings with chimneys or enclosed fires by the later medieval period, especially in wealthier parishes. These fires are small and symbolic, but they matter. People rotate near them, warming hands briefly before yielding space to someone weaker. A fringe belief surfaces that dying in a church during winter is a good death. It places the soul closer to salvation, buffered by holy ground. This belief softens fear for some, making the church not just a shelter for the living, but a threshold for the dying. You feel the weight of that dual role pressing down on the space. Sound carries differently here. Wind howls outside, but inside there's murmured prayer, low conversation, the occasional sob quickly muffled. Bells are silent now. They would be useless in this storm, but their presence looms overhead, a reminder that this building connects the village to a wider world, even when roads are buried. You notice how people bring pieces of home with them, a cooking pot, a favourite blanket, a child's toy. These small comforts carve out personal spaces within the communal shelter. Winter survival is not just about warmth, it's about maintaining identity when everything else is stripped away. The church also becomes an information hub. Messengers arriving between storms bring news of other villages buried, of rivers frozen solid, of markets cancelled. Each update reshapes expectations. Hope rises and falls with these fragments of information, just as vital as food. As night deepens, exhaustion settles in. People sleep sitting up, leaning against one another, heads bowed not in prayer but in fatigue. The church smells of wet wool, smoke and humanity. It's not comforting, but it's safer than being alone. When you finally step back outside days later, the church doors close behind you, sealing in warmth and lingering breath. You realise that during medieval blizzards, survival sometimes meant surrendering privacy and routine to a shared sacred space. The church did not banish the cold, but it gathered people together tightly enough to endure it. As winter deepens, the line between human and animal space begins to blur, not out of neglect, but necessity. You notice it first in the sounds, soft snorts, the shuffle of hooves, the steady warmth of breath where you don't expect it. Livestock, normally kept at a distance, are brought closer, sometimes under the same roof. In deadly blizzards, animals are not just property, they are portable furnaces. A solid historical fact grounds this practice. In many parts of medieval England, especially among poorer households, animals were sheltered in byres attached to living spaces, or even within the main structure itself. This wasn't ignorance of hygiene, it was strategy. A cow or several sheep generate significant body heat, and that warmth seeps through walls, floors, and shared air. You feel it immediately. The space nearest the animals is warmer, more humid. The smell is strong, manure, hay, damp fur, but tolerable when weighed against freezing. Winter reshapes priorities. Cleanliness yields to survival, and comfort is redefined in the most basic terms. A quirky detail you hadn't anticipated is how animals seem to understand the arrangement. They grow calmer indoors, conserving energy, huddling together much like the humans do. There's an unspoken rhythm between species here. People move quietly around them, careful not to startle or stress them, because a panicked animal in confined space is dangerous. There's scholarly debate about how widespread indoor livestock housing truly was. Some historians argue it was common only in marginal regions or among the very poor. Others point to architectural remains suggesting it was more normalised than previously thought. Standing here, sharing air with cattle, you realise that when blizzards hit, ideals and norms bend quickly. What works survives. Animals are wealth, labour, and future food supply. Letting them freeze would be catastrophic, so they are prioritised alongside people. You see hay rationed carefully, water thawed repeatedly, ice broken from troughs indoors. The work is constant, but purposeful. Every living body kept alive strengthens the household's odds of surviving winter as a whole. There's also a fringe belief that animals bring spiritual protection. Some folk traditions hold that the presence of livestock wards off misfortune or evil spirits during storms. Whether believed literally or not, the idea that animals and humans weather winter together carries emotional weight. You sense a quiet comfort in not being alone, in hearing steady breathing through the night. Of course, this closeness has consequences. Disease spreads more easily, parasites thrive, respiratory illnesses pass between animals and humans in ways no one understands. Medieval people don't know about pathogens, but they recognise patterns. A sick animal in winter is ominous, often leading to desperate choices, slaughtering earlier than planned to salvage meat before decay sets in. Noise becomes part of sleep. You lie awake listening to shifting weight, the scrape of hoof on stone, the occasional low call. It's oddly reassuring. Sound means life. Silence is what people fear most in winter. You notice how space is negotiated. Animals are tethered, penned, or separated by low walls, but always close enough for warmth to transfer. Children are warned not to sleep too near hooves. Elders are positioned where air is warmest but safest. The household reorganises itself around heat gradients rather than status. Another historical truth emerges: manure itself is valuable. Dung is collected, dried, and sometimes burned when fuel is scarce. Even waste becomes warmth. Nothing is wasted in winter. Not effort, not energy, not byproducts of survival. As days pass, the boundary between indoors and outdoors dissolves further. Snow presses against walls, animals press inward, people press together. The house becomes a living organism, breathing slowly, adapting moment by moment to the cold pressing in from all sides. You realise now that medieval survival during blizzards depended on accepting discomfort without shame. Sharing space with animals is not a failure, it's a solution. In a world without heating, warmth comes from bodies, human and otherwise, bound together by necessity. And in that shared breath and heat, life persists through the worst of winter's cruelty. As the blizzard stretches on, your thoughts keep circling back to one fragile pillar holding everything together. Fuel, firewood, peat, charcoal. These are not conveniences. They are lifelines measured carefully long before winter begins. You feel the tension around fuel immediately, the way every log added to the hearth is noticed, weighed, silently debated. A firm historical fact shapes this anxiety. Medieval England faced increasing fuel scarcity by the late Middle Ages, especially in heavily populated regions. Forests had been steadily cleared for agriculture and building, and access to remaining woodland was often controlled by lords. Taking wood without permission could result in severe punishment, yet winter desperation frequently pushed people to risk it. You hear quiet arguments about when to burn more and when to endure the cold. Fires are kept low, often barely more than glowing embers. The goal is not warmth, but survival through continuity, never letting the fire die completely. A roaring blaze feels indulgent, even reckless, unless someone is gravely ill. Peat becomes invaluable where it's available. Cut from bogs during warmer months, dried, stacked and guarded, peat burns slowly and steadily. Its smoke is thick and pungent, clinging to everything, but it lasts longer than wood. You smell it everywhere now, a damp, earthy scent that signals careful planning months in advance. A quirky detail emerges in how people talk about fuel. Logs are counted like coins. Someone might say, "We have 3 nights left," not in food, but in fire. This language reveals priorities starkly. Heat is time, and time is life. There's scholarly debate over how often fuel shortages turned violent. Some historians argue that competition for firewood led to theft, sabotage, even deadly disputes during harsh winters. Others suggest communities largely avoided conflict, understanding that destruction of shared resources doomed everyone. Watching the careful cooperation here, you sense that fear keeps tempers in check, but only just. Fuel gathering in winter is brutal. You watch someone return from the edge of the village, beard crusted with ice, carrying branches snapped from hedgerows. These makeshift sources burn poorly, producing more smoke than heat, but they are used anyway. When survival is at stake, efficiency becomes secondary to availability. Charcoal, when it appears, is treated with reverence. It burns hot and clean, but producing it requires labour and resources unavailable to most peasants. You associate it with blacksmiths, monasteries, or wealthy households. Its presence in a hearth is a visible marker of status, even in winter misery. A fringe belief surfaces that wasting fire invites misfortune. Letting sparks fly unchecked, or allowing a log to burn too fast is seen not just as careless, but morally wrong. Fire is personified, treated almost as a guest that must be respected. This belief reinforces discipline when comfort tempts excess. You also notice strategic cold zones inside the house. Areas far from the hearth are intentionally left unused to conserve heat. Furniture is rearranged. Living space shrinks. The house contracts inward as fuel dwindles, focusing life into a smaller and smaller core. Night amplifies the fear. Fires burn lowest then, when sleep makes vigilance harder. Someone always wakes to check embers, stirring ash, feeding a sliver of fuel just enough to keep life glowing. Oversleeping can be fatal, not dramatically but quietly as cold tightens its grip. Outside you hear trees cracking under frost, a sound sharp enough to startle. It reminds you that fuel sources are freezing solid, becoming harder to access by the day. Every crack feels like time running out. By now you understand that medieval winter survival is not only about enduring cold, it's about managing fire like a finite resource, stretched across weeks of uncertainty. Each ember represents foresight, restraint, and shared trust. As the blizzard continues, you sit watching the hearth, counting burns without numbers, measuring warmth without comfort. In this world without heating, fire is not background. It is the fragile heartbeat of survival, pulsing weakly but stubbornly against the cold pressing in from every side. Work does not stop in winter, it mutates. You feel this shift the moment daylight breaks, pale and short-lived. There's no illusion of productivity now. Tasks are chosen not for profit, but for survival. Anything that risks prolonged exposure is delayed or abandoned. Winter dictates the schedule and you simply follow. A clear historical fact defines this adaptation. Medieval agricultural labour slows dramatically during severe winters, especially during blizzards. Fields lie dormant, ploughs rest, and outdoor work is limited to essential maintenance and animal care. Manorial records show winter as a season of reduced obligations, not leisure, but enforced restraint. Inside, work becomes repetitive and rhythmic. Spinning wool, mending clothes, repairing tools, tasks that keep hands moving without demanding precision. You notice how people rotate near the hearth, warming fingers before returning to their work. Productivity is measured in minutes, not hours. Fingers stiffen quickly, and mistakes cost more energy than they're worth. A quirky detail emerges in how tools are treated. Metal implements are warmed before use, held near the fire to prevent them from stealing heat from bare hands. You try gripping a cold tool once and immediately understand why. The chill bites deep, radiating into your arm. Warm the tool and the task becomes bearable. There's debate among historians about whether winter was a time of innovation or stagnation. Some argue that indoor months encouraged craft development, storytelling and planning. Others suggest exhaustion and scarcity limited creativity. Watching the slow, careful pace here, you suspect winter fosters maintenance rather than invention. Keeping things working matters more than improving them. Children are given small tasks, not to build character, but to keep them moving and warm. Fetching kindling, turning spits, winding yarn. Stillness is discouraged. Even play involves motion. Games are rough, physical, designed to generate heat. Laughter, when it comes, is sharp and brief, cutting through the cold like a spark. Workdays shrink with the light. Candles are too valuable to waste on extended labour. When darkness falls, Tasks stop unless absolutely necessary. This enforced rest is not relaxing. It's restless, filled with listening, waiting, and conserving strength for morning. A fringe belief surfaces that winter idleness invites misfortune. Too much stillness is seen as dangerous, a sign of surrender. So people stay busy, even if the work is symbolic. Reorganizing stores, recounting supplies, telling stories of past winters survived. Activity becomes psychological insulation. You also see how injury is feared more than in any other season. A cut hand, a twisted ankle. These can be fatal when healing is slow and infection thrives. So work is cautious, conservative. Risk is minimized. Winter is not the time for heroics. Those whose labour is tied to survival, millers, blacksmiths, healers, become even more vital. When mills freeze or roads are blocked, grain must be ground by hand. You feel the strain in your arms, the inefficiency of manual labour reintroduced by weather alone. You notice how work reinforces social bonds. Tasks are shared, rotated, completed together. Isolation increases danger. Even skilled work is done in company, partly for warmth, partly for watchfulness. If someone falters, someone else notices. As the blizzard eases briefly, you step outside to clear snow from a doorway, muscles burning, breath tearing at your chest. It's brutal, exhausting work, but it's also reassuring. Action feels like defiance. When you return indoors, cheeks numb, hands trembling, the hearth's glow feels earned. You understand now that medieval winter labour isn't about productivity. It's about maintaining the thin systems that keep life functioning until the cold loosens its grip. In deadly blizzards, work becomes survival in motion, small, careful acts repeated daily, each one a quiet refusal to let winter decide the end of the story. As winter drags on, you realise that survival isn't only physical, it's predictive. People watch the sky, the wind, the behaviour of animals, searching for signs of what's coming next. Without forecasts, knowledge of weather becomes folklore, observation, and inherited instinct. You begin to see how seriously these signs are taken, especially when blizzards threaten. A firm historical fact underpins this awareness. Medieval England relied heavily on seasonal and environmental knowledge passed down orally. Farmers tracked patterns in frost, wind direction, and snowfall to anticipate harsh conditions. While not scientific by modern standards, this knowledge often proved reliable enough to guide preparation. You notice how the wind is discussed constantly. A northerly wind brings dread, associated with bitter cold and snow sweeping down from higher latitudes. A shift to the west suggests moisture and thaw. People step outside just long enough to feel it on their faces, then return to report their findings like messengers from the edge of the world. A quirky detail surfaces in the way animals are watched. Chickens roosting early, dogs refusing to go outside, livestock clustering tighter than usual. These behaviours are read as warnings. You're surprised at how much attention people pay to these signs, and how often decisions are made based on them. Delay a journey. Burn a little more fuel tonight. Bring animals inside sooner. There's ongoing scholarly debate about how accurate medieval weather law truly was. Some historians dismiss it as superstition layered over coincidence. Others argue that long-term observation created functional, experience-based forecasting. Living here, you sense that accuracy matters less than responsiveness. Belief prompts action, and action saves lives. Certain dates carry reputations. Saints' days are said to predict the coming weeks. If a particular feast day is clear, winter may ease. If it storms, worse is expected. These associations provide structure to uncertainty, anchoring fear to the calendar. A fringe belief whispers that harsh winters reflect moral imbalance, either communal sin or divine testing. This belief influences behaviour subtly. People attend church more often during blizzards, pray louder, argue less publicly. Whether or not the weather changes, behaviour does, and that cohesion can matter. You also see practical forecasting in food and fuel management. Stores are not used evenly. If signs point to prolonged cold, rations tighten immediately. It's painful, but necessary. Better to endure hunger now than freeze later. This decision-making requires trust in shared knowledge and leadership. Night skies are watched when visible. Clear, star-filled nights are beautiful but feared. They mean temperatures will plunge. Cloud cover, though dreary, offers insulation. You feel this truth in your bones after one clear night leaves the house colder than any storm. Children learn these signs early. You hear them repeating sayings, absorbing lessons long before they understand them fully. Weather knowledge becomes cultural inheritance, passed down like recipes or prayers. You realise that this constant watching shapes the medieval mindset. Life feels reactive, provisional. Plans are always subject to revision. Flexibility becomes a survival skill, as important as strength or courage. When the blizzard returns despite hopeful signs, disappointment ripples through the household, but not surprise. People adapt quickly, adjusting routines without complaint. Expectation management is part of resilience. As you sit listening to wind scrape the walls again, you understand that medieval survival in deadly blizzards depends not on controlling nature, but on reading it closely and responding fast. Prediction, however imperfect, gives people a sense of agency in a world where control is scarce. In the absence of heating, forecasts are not about comfort. They are about survival. Knowing when the cold will deepen or ease shapes every choice, every ration, every risk. And in that constant vigilance, people carve out just enough foresight to endure winter's long, uncertain grip. Eventually, cold is no longer the only enemy. Hunger joins it. Quiet at first, then insistent. You feel the shift when meals grow smaller without explanation, when fat disappears from the pot, when bread is sliced thinner. Winter blizzards don't just freeze the land, they interrupt the delicate systems that keep food moving. And when those systems stall, famine lurks close behind. A hard historical fact anchors this fear. Medieval England experienced repeated episodes of winter famine, often triggered or worsened by severe weather. Heavy snow-blocked roads froze mills and delayed grain transport. Even regions with stored food could find themselves unable to access it, when blizzards isolated communities for weeks. You notice how hunger changes behaviour. People speak less during meals, concentrating on each bite. Children are distracted with tasks or stories to dull their appetite. The warmth food once provided now feels fleeting, gone almost as soon as it arrives. Cold burns calories faster than they can be replaced. A quirky detail surfaces in how people stretch meals. Pottage is thinned with water, bulked with anything edible. Ground acorns, dried peas, even powdered bark in the worst years. These additions don't nourish much, but they create fullness, tricking the body long enough to get through another night. There's scholarly debate about how common true starvation was versus chronic undernourishment. Some historians argue that medieval people lived constantly on the edge, making famine an ever-present threat. Others suggest that while winters were harsh, total starvation was less common than feared. Sitting here, feeling your own energy dip, you realise how narrow the distinction is. Weakness can be just as deadly as outright hunger. Blizzards amplify inequality brutally. Those with larger stores, access to church granaries, or ties to wealthy patrons survive longer. The poor, the landless, and widows feel hunger first. You see how social safety nets exist, but they stretch thin quickly. A fringe belief surfaces that hunger in winter purifies the soul. Fasting is framed as spiritual discipline, even when it's not voluntary. This belief offers meaning to suffering, but it also discourages complaint. People endure silently, interpreting pain as necessity or virtue. Illness rises with hunger. Bodies already strained by cold have little resistance left. You notice coughs linger longer, wounds heal slower. Medical care is limited, and what remedies exist often require ingredients now unavailable. Hunger and cold reinforce each other, a closed loop of decline. Communal sharing becomes harder as scarcity deepens. The same neighbours who shared freely earlier now hesitate, glancing at their own shrinking stores. This doesn't mean compassion disappears, it means calculation intrudes. Survival demands it. You also see desperation spark risky choices. Some attempt travel through snow to reach markets or relatives, despite the danger. Others sneak into forests to gather forbidden wood or forage, risking punishment or worse. Hunger loosens fear's grip, pushing people toward gambles they wouldn't take otherwise. Children sense the tension even if they don't understand it fully. Their play grows quieter. Their questions about food become more frequent. You feel how the future feels fragile now, balanced on what remains in storage bins. When a meal finally comes, a rare moment of abundance from shared reserves or church aid, it feels almost overwhelming. People eat slowly, reverently, as if afraid the food might vanish mid-bite. Warmth spreads again, briefly, reminding everyone what they're fighting for. You understand now that surviving medieval blizzards without heating isn't just about staying warm, it's about staying fed when cold sabotages every supply line. Hunger doesn't arrive with drama, it seeps in day by day until endurance itself becomes the final ration. When you think about winter suffering, it's tempting to imagine that wealth erased it. Stepping into the world of medieval nobility during a blizzard quickly corrects that assumption. Yes, conditions are different, but not comfortable by any modern standard. Cold respects rank more than you expect, and stone castles are some of its favourite places to linger. A solid historical fact sets the scene. Medieval castles and manor houses were notoriously difficult to heat. Their thick stone walls provided defence, not insulation. Fireplaces existed, sometimes in multiple rooms, but heat travelled poorly. Large chambers swallowed warmth almost as fast as it was produced. Even the wealthy lived in pockets of heat surrounded by cold. You enter a great hall and feel it immediately. The space is vast, echoing, impressive, and frigid. A fire roars at one end, but only those closest benefit. Tapestries hang from the walls, not as decoration alone, but as draft blockers. Rugs cover stone floors to reduce heat loss through feet. Every textile is working overtime. A quirky detail surprises you. Nobles often migrate within their own homes during winter. Entire households relocate to smaller chambers that are easier to heat, abandoning grand rooms until spring. Power adapts to physics. Prestige yields to practicality. Clothing among the elite is more elaborate but follows the same principles. Fine wool, fur-lined cloaks, layered garments. Fur is not just status, it's survival. Ermine, squirrel, fox and sheepskin all appear, chosen for warmth as much as symbolism. Still, fingers numb and breath fogs indoors just as it does in peasant homes. There's scholarly debate about whether nobles actually fared significantly better during extreme winters. Some argue access to food, fuel, and servants insulated them from the worst effects. Others note that isolation in large cold structures increased illness and mortality. Watching servants hurry to stoke fires and deliver warmed wine, you sense that privilege reduces risk, but never removes it. Food is more abundant here, and that matters. Rich winter diets include meat, fat, and imported goods, even when roads are unreliable. Calories cushion the cold. But abundance brings its own problems. Overcrowded halls, poor ventilation, and constant smoke contribute to respiratory illness. You hear coughing echo off stone, lingering longer than it should. A fringe belief among the elite frames endurance of cold as a sign of virtue and leadership. Lords boast of tolerating winter hardships alongside their people, even when reality is more nuanced. Image matters. Suffering, when visible, becomes political capital. Servants absorb much of the winter's burden. They rise early to rekindle fires, haul fuel through snow, warm rooms before their lord arrives. Their exposure is constant, their exhaustion quiet. You notice how survival at the top depends on sacrifice at the bottom. Castles also become administrative bottlenecks in winter. Petitions pile up, travel halts, decisions are delayed. Governance slows with the weather. You feel how power itself becomes sluggish, constrained by cold just like everything else. Despite differences in setting and scale, the rhythm feels familiar now. Fires managed carefully, space contracted, movement minimized, sleep fragmented. The same strategies repeat, only dressed in finer fabric. As you stand in a drafty corridor, listening to wind howl against battlements, you realize something essential. Medieval winter is a leveling force. It exposes the limits of wealth, architecture, and authority. Nobles may suffer less, but they still suffer. Without heating, even the powerful negotiate with cold rather than conquer it. Stone halls, like thatched cottages, bend inward toward fire and body heat. And as blizzards rage outside castle walls, survival remains what it has always been. Less about status, more about endurance, planning, and the fragile warmth of human effort. Monasteries feel different in winter. Not warmer, but more controlled. As you step into one during a blizzard, you sense a rhythm already in place, practiced over generations. These communities expect cold. They plan for it, ritualize it, and endure it with a discipline that feels almost architectural. A solid historical fact grounds this impression. Medieval monasteries in England followed strict daily routines regardless of season, guided by the rule of St. Benedict or similar orders. These rules emphasise simplicity, silence and endurance, including acceptance of physical discomfort. Heating was limited by design, not just scarcity. Stone cloisters echo with footsteps, each breath visible in the air. Fires exist, but they are few and carefully regulated. The calefactory, the warming room, is often the only space where sustained heat is permitted. You see monks rotate through it briefly, warming hands and joints before returning to unheated workspaces. Warmth here is rationed like everything else. A quirky detail surprises you. Monks sometimes warm themselves by reading aloud. The act of speaking continuously generates heat, and communal reading sessions serve a dual purpose: spiritual instruction and physical endurance. You feel the subtle genius of this practice when silence itself becomes cold. There's scholarly debate about whether monastic life was healthier or harsher in winter than secular life. Some historians argue that reliable food supplies and communal structure improved survival rates. Others note that constant cold exposure in stone buildings increased respiratory illness. Standing in a drafty scriptorium, fingers stiff as you imagine copying manuscripts, you suspect the truth lies somewhere in between. Clothing is simple but effective. Heavy wool habits, layered and worn constantly. Hoods stay up indoors. Bare feet touch stone floors only briefly before sandals or cloth wraps intervene. Asceticism does not mean recklessness. Monks value life as a vessel for devotion, and survival is part of that calling. Food is plain but steady. Monasteries often have better stores than villages, including preserved fish, grains, and ale. Regular meals provide caloric stability that many peasants lack. You feel the difference almost immediately. Less hunger, more resilience. Structure itself becomes warmth of a kind. A fringe belief runs quietly through monastic winter life. Suffering endured without complaint brings spiritual clarity. Cold sharpens focus, strips away distraction. Whether this belief is comforting or burdensome depends on the monk and on the night. You sense both serenity and strain coexisting in the same breath. Work continues regardless of weather. Prayers at fixed hours, manuscripts copied by numb fingers, candles tended carefully. The predictability of routine anchors the mind when the outside world is chaos. You feel how this constancy protects against despair as much as hunger or cold. Monasteries also serve as refuges. Travellers, the poor, the sick. Some are admitted during extreme weather. Space is limited and charity is measured, but the presence of extra bodies brings both warmth and risk. Illness is feared, yet turning people away carries moral weight. Night is hardest. Dormitories are cold, vast, echoing. Beds are simple, spacing minimal. Silence dominates, broken only by coughs and the wind pressing against stone. Sleep comes lightly, but it comes, held together by routine and faith. As you move through the monastery, you realise that winter survival here relies less on material advantage and more on discipline. Predictability replaces comfort. Purpose replaces ease. Without heating, monasteries endure blizzards not by resisting cold, but by integrating it into daily life. The cold becomes part of devotion, part of identity. And in that acceptance, structured, shared, relentless, you see another path medieval England used to survive the long frozen months. As winter tightens its grip, illness begins to spread with a quiet inevitability. You notice it first in the coughs, dry, persistent, echoing in sealed rooms where fresh air is a luxury no one can afford. Cold doesn't just weaken the body, it reshapes the environment in ways that invite sickness inside and refuse to let it leave. A hard historical fact frames this danger. Medieval winters were peak seasons for disease, particularly respiratory infections, pneumonia, and what chroniclers broadly described as fevers. With homes sealed against the cold and smoke lingering in the air, lungs suffered constantly. The very strategies that kept people warm also trapped illness. You feel the stale air settle heavy on your chest. Windows remain shuttered, doors open only briefly. Smoke from peat and wood fires thickens the room, irritating eyes and throats. People cough into sleeves, turn away politely, but no one truly escapes exposure. Illness moves slowly, house to house, as predictable as the cold itself. A quirky detail emerges in how people respond to sickness. Rather than isolating the ill completely, which would risk freezing them, care happens close and constant. Warmth takes precedence over quarantine. Someone sick is wrapped in blankets, kept near the fire and surrounded by others despite the risk. You sense the impossible choice: freeze alone or fall ill together. There's scholarly debate about how much medieval medical practices helped or harmed winter illness. Some historians argue that bloodletting and purging weakened patients further. Others note that rest, warmth, and hydration, common prescriptions, may have offered real benefit. Sitting beside someone feverish, you understand that even misguided care is driven by observation and hope. Herbal remedies surface everywhere. You smell thyme, sage, garlic, and honey mixed into broths or infusions. These are not cures, but they soothe throats and offer calories. You watch how people cling to these small interventions, repeating them carefully, as if precision might summon relief. A fringe belief whispers that illness in winter is a test of character or faith. Those who recover are seen as favoured or strong. Those who don't are mourned quietly, sometimes with the uneasy implication that something was lacking. This belief comforts survivors but deepens grief. Children and the elderly are most vulnerable. You see extra effort made to keep them warm, fed and attended. Yet you also sense the fear when someone very young or very old develops a cough. The household's mood shifts instantly. Conversation hushed, movements deliberate. Sleep becomes restless. Coughing wakes everyone. Fever dreams spill into muttered prayers. You feel how exhaustion compounds illness, each feeding the other. Recovery, when it comes, is slow and uncertain. Death, when it happens, is handled swiftly. Frozen ground delays burial, so bodies are wrapped and kept in cold storage spaces until graves can be dug. The proximity to death feels closer in winter, less abstract. You smell it in the air, feel it in the way people touch one another gently, as if acknowledging fragility without naming it. Despite this, care continues. Someone always sits through the night with the sick, feeding the fire, wiping brows, murmuring comfort. These acts are quiet, repetitive, and profoundly human. In winter, care itself becomes a survival skill. As you sit listening to wind and coughs intertwine, you understand that medieval survival during deadly blizzards is not just about avoiding cold, it's about enduring sickness in its wake. Warmth protects the body, but community protects the spirit. And in rooms thick with smoke and breath, people cling to both, hoping to outlast the season together. Winter does not threaten everyone equally, and you see this most clearly when you watch who is guarded most closely. Children and the elderly move through the cold as if it's hunting them specifically. Their steps are slower, their reserves thinner. In deadly blizzards, the margin for error narrows sharply at both ends of life. A firm historical fact shapes this reality. Medieval mortality rates were significantly higher among infants, young children, and the elderly during winter months. Parish records and burial data show seasonal spikes, reflecting vulnerability to cold, hunger, and illness combined. Survival often depended less on strength and more on protection. You notice how children are bundled obsessively, caps tied tight, scarves wrapped high, extra layers even indoors. They're kept close to adults, often carried rather than allowed to walk outside. Play is monitored, not to suppress joy, but to prevent dangerous exhaustion or dampness. Wet clothing is a quiet emergency. Elders, meanwhile, are positioned carefully within the household. They sleep closest to the hearth, eat first when food is scarce, and are excused from tasks that require exposure. Respect blends with practicality. Their bodies simply cannot afford the cold the way younger ones sometimes can. A quirky detail surfaces in how children are used as heat sources. Infants are held constantly, passed from arm to arm, kept against adult bodies day and night. This is affection, yes, but it's also thermal strategy. You feel the instinctive logic of it immediately. There's scholarly debate about how societies valued the elderly in medieval England. Some argue that elders were burdens during times of scarcity. Others point to evidence of care and reverence. Watching winter unfold here, you sense that attitudes shift with resources. In harsh blizzards, compassion competes with fear, but it rarely disappears. Children are also seen as omens. A child falling ill in winter is viewed with particular dread, sometimes interpreted as a sign of worse to come. You hear whispered prayers, see extra candles lit. Fear sharpens belief. For the elderly, illness carries finality. Recovery is uncertain, and when strength fails, the decline is swift. You see how people speak softly around them, adjusting routines subtly, as if preparing without admitting it. Winter makes endings feel closer, more inevitable. Caregiving intensifies. Someone always stays nearby, feeding fires, bringing warm drinks, adjusting blankets. These acts slow other work, but no one argues. Winter clarifies priorities brutally. A fringe belief lingers that those who survive many winters carry wisdom worth protecting. Elders tell stories during long nights, recounting storms worse than this one, reminding everyone that survival has happened before. These stories do more than entertain, they reinforce hope. Yet loss happens anyway. When a child or elder dies, grief is contained, almost compressed. There's no room for prolonged mourning when cold demands attention. Tears freeze quickly, literally and figuratively. You feel the emotional toll of this restraint. Love is expressed through action rather than words, through warmth shared, food given, watchfulness maintained. Winter reshapes affection into labour. As you watch a child fall asleep against an elder's shoulder, both wrapped in layers of wool, you understand how medieval survival in blizzards hinges on protecting those least able to protect themselves. The cold doesn't care who you are, but people do. And in that care, however fragile, life pushes back against winter's relentless claim. As the blizzards rage and nights stretch long, stories begin to thicken the air almost as much as smoke. You hear them whispered near the hearth, murmured in church corners, shared cautiously with children just before sleep. Winter doesn't just freeze bodies, it reshapes imagination. Fear looks for language, and folklore answers. A solid historical fact grounds these tales. Much of medieval English folklore intensified during winter months, when isolation, darkness, and danger were at their peak. Oral tradition thrived in these conditions, offering explanations for suffering that daily life could not provide. Stories became tools, warnings, comforts, and shared psychological insulation. You notice how snow itself is personified. It's not just weather, it's a presence. People speak of it creeping, stalking, burying. In some tales, snow hides spirits or invites them closer to the living world. The idea that winter thins the veil between worlds feels less abstract when you're surrounded by white silence and flickering firelight. A quirky detail emerges in how storms are named informally. The Widowmaker, the White Hunger, God's Breath. These aren't official titles, but they recur across regions, suggesting shared memory. Naming a storm gives it shape, making it easier to talk about and survive, something otherwise overwhelming. Folklore also explains tragedy. Someone lost in a blizzard may be said to have been called away by spirits or misled by a wandering light. These explanations soften blame. They allow grief without endless questioning. In a world where accidents are common and answers scarce, stories provide emotional closure. There's scholarly debate about whether medieval people truly believed these tales or used them symbolically. Some historians argue folklore reflected literal belief systems. Others suggest it functioned more like metaphor, a narrative language for fear and uncertainty. Sitting here, listening, you realise belief isn't binary. Stories can be comforting even if only half believed. Children absorb these tales quickly. Winter stories teach them not to wander, not to stray from known paths, not to underestimate snow. Fear becomes educational. You sense how folklore substitutes for formal instruction, embedding survival lessons in memory through emotion. A fringe belief surfaces that telling certain stories can invite bad luck if done carelessly. Some tales are only told during storms, others never spoken aloud. This selective silence adds weight to the words that are shared. Not all stories are safe, just as not all paths are. You also hear tales of miraculous survival. People found alive after days buried in snow, guided home by bells or animals, preserved by faith or fate. These stories circulate widely, regardless of accuracy. They matter because they counterbalance loss. Hope, even exaggerated, is fuel. Folklore shapes behaviour subtly. People avoid whistling during storms, believing it attracts wind. Doors are marked with symbols for protection. Fires are blessed. These acts don't change the weather, but they change how people feel, less helpless, more involved in their own fate. You realise that winter folklore isn't about fantasy. It's about control. When cold strips away agency, stories restore a sense of order. Even a frightening explanation is better than none. As the blizzard howls outside and shadows dance along the walls, you feel how these tales bind the community together. Everyone knows them, everyone shares them. They become a common language for fear, endurance, and memory. In medieval England, surviving deadly blizzards isn't just a physical challenge, it's a narrative one. People survive by wrapping meaning around suffering, by telling stories that make winter intelligible, if not kind. And as another tale fades into the crackle of embers, you understand that folklore is not a distraction from survival. It's part of it. When warmth is scarce and danger omnipresent, stories become shelter too. Some winters refuse to fade into memory. They carve themselves into chronicles, margins of manuscripts, and the collective nerves of generations. You hear their names spoken with a certain weight, voices lowering instinctively as if the cold might hear. These are the winters that redefine what survival means. A firm historical fact anchors these stories. Medieval England experienced several winters so severe they were recorded explicitly by chroniclers, including the winters of 1315 to 1317 during the Great Famine and the deep freezes of the late 14th century. Rivers like the Thames froze hard enough to walk on, mills stopped turning, and entire regions were pushed to the brink. You imagine standing beside the Thames as ice locks it solid, trade frozen in place along with the water. Barges sit useless, grain stranded upriver, bread prices rising by the day. Snow doesn't just fall, it stays. Week after week the landscape becomes static, buried under a white permanence that erases seasons themselves. A quirky detail appears in these accounts. Chroniclers often describe the cold as unnatural or monstrous, language usually reserved for omens. This isn't casual exaggeration. When winters last longer than memory allows for, they feel like a rupture in the natural order. You feel how terrifying that would be, when survival depends on predictability. These winters expose every weakness in medieval systems. Roads vanish, isolating towns, mills freeze, halting flour production even when grain exists. Livestock die in droves, collapsing food supplies months later. You understand how blizzards don't just kill directly, they trigger delayed disasters that echo long after snow melts. There's scholarly debate about whether these winters were truly exceptional or simply better documented. Some historians argue medieval chroniclers dramatised hardship for moral or religious effect. Others point to physical evidence, tree rings, ice cores, supporting periods of extreme cold. Listening to the stories passed down here, you sense that memory itself becomes evidence. You hear of people burning furniture, tools, even parts of their homes to stay warm. This isn't metaphor, it's last resort. A chair can be replaced in spring, a life cannot. These choices haunt survivors long after warmth returns, reshaping households permanently. A fringe belief emerges that these winters are divine warnings, meant to humble kingdoms or punish excess. This belief gains traction when suffering is widespread enough to feel collective. When everyone is cold, explanations turn upward. You see rulers ordering public prayers, fasts and processions, sometimes worsening conditions by pulling people into the cold together. Yet even in the worst winters, there are stories of adaptation. Ice roads form atop frozen rivers, becoming temporary highways. People learn to cut channels through snow, creating corridors between buildings. Survival becomes improvisation on a massive scale. You also notice how these winters accelerate change. Fuel shortages push innovation, demand for chimneys rises, wool production expands, hardship forces evolution, slowly reshaping how people build, dress, and plan for cold. Suffering leaves fingerprints on the future. Children born during these winters grow up hearing how close their families came to extinction. These stories shape identity. To have survived that winter becomes a badge of endurance, passed down with pride and lingering trauma. As you sit listening to one such tale, you realise these record-breaking winters function like historical anchors. They give people a reference point for fear and resilience. Not as bad as the Great Winter, someone says, and hope flickers back to life. You feel the psychological weight of living through a season that might be remembered for centuries. Every decision feels heavier, more consequential. You're not just surviving, you're participating in history whether you want to or not. When spring finally comes after such a winter, it doesn't arrive gently. Floods follow thawed ice. Disease spreads. Recovery is slow, but survival itself feels monumental. The world didn't end. That matters. You understand now that medieval people didn't just endure blizzards, they remembered them, recorded them, measured future suffering against them. These winters became lessons etched into culture. And as another tale of frozen rivers and buried villages fades into silence, you sense how memory itself becomes a survival tool. If the cold returns, and it always does, people will remember that they have lived through worse. And sometimes, that knowledge is enough to keep going. And when you listen closely to the way people talk about winter, you notice uncertainty woven into every explanation. Was it always this cold? Is the weather changing? Or is this simply how things have always been? These questions echo quietly through medieval England, long before anyone has the language to call it climate. A solid historical fact anchors this uncertainty. The period from roughly the late 13th to early 15th centuries coincides with the onset of what scholars later termed the Little Ice Age. While medieval people didn't recognise a global climate shift, they did notice patterns: longer winters, unpredictable harvests, and more frequent severe storms. You hear farmers argue about memory. Older villagers insist winters were gentler when they were young. Younger ones know only hardship. This generational divide feeds debate, not consensus. Weather becomes personal history rather than data, shaped by experience more than records. A quirky detail surfaces in how people use landmarks to measure change. The river froze past the old oak, someone says, referencing a tree long gone. Memory stretches beyond the physical world, turning lost features into climatic benchmarks. You realise how unreliable and emotionally charged this kind of evidence can be. There's ongoing scholarly debate today that mirrors these medieval conversations. Some historians argue medieval chroniclers exaggerated cold for dramatic or moral effect. Others point to proxy data like tree rings and glacial advance supporting genuine cooling. Sitting here, you feel how both perspectives coexist naturally when lived experience replaces measurement. The absence of heating magnifies perception. A slight drop in average temperature feels catastrophic when survival depends on body heat and fire. You suspect that even modest climate shifts would feel extreme under these conditions, amplifying memory and fear. A fringe belief circulates that human behaviour influences weather. Sin invites cold, repentance invites warmth. This belief turns climate into moral feedback. When winters worsen, people search inward rather than outward. You see how this framework offers agency, even if it misplaces cause. Communities adapt based on what they believe. If winters are getting worse, they store more, build thicker walls, rely more on wool. If cold is seen as cyclical, preparation ebbs and flows. Belief shapes infrastructure as much as reality does. You notice how monasteries and scholars begin recording weather more systematically during harsh periods. Notes about freezes, snowfall, and failed harvests appear alongside prayers and accounts. Hardship encourages documentation, the first faint steps toward climatology. Yet disagreement persists. One harsh winter proves nothing, some argue. Others insist it confirms a trend. Without long-term records, certainty is impossible. Survival, meanwhile, cannot wait for consensus. You feel the emotional weight of living inside an unresolved debate. Every winter might be worse than the last, or simply another trial. The uncertainty itself is exhausting, eroding confidence in the future. Despite this, life continues. People plan weddings cautiously, delay travel, adjust planting schedules. Flexibility becomes the default response to uncertainty. You sense how adaptation matters more than explanation. As you sit by the fire listening to these arguments, you realise that medieval survival during blizzards unfolds inside a cloud of ambiguity. People act without knowing whether conditions will improve or deteriorate permanently. In a world without heating, climate isn't an abstract concept. It's a daily negotiation with cold, hunger, and hope. Debates about weather matter not because they resolve truth, but because they shape how people prepare to survive what comes next. And as another winter night deepens, unresolved but endured, you understand that medieval people didn't need to know why the cold came to face it. They needed only to believe that adaptation, however imperfect, was possible. As winter stretches on, you begin to notice something less visible than hunger or cold, but just as dangerous: the slow erosion of the mind. Days blur together in a grey sameness, broken only by meals, chores, and the constant negotiation with fire. The blizzard doesn't just isolate villages, it compresses time itself. You lose track of dates, You measure life in nights survived. A solid historical fact underlies this psychological strain. Medieval winters brought extended darkness and limited daylight, especially during severe storms when clouds swallowed what little sun there was. Without artificial lighting beyond candles and firelight, daily rhythms narrowed dramatically. This lack of light affected mood, energy and perception, long before anyone had words like seasonal depression. You feel it in the quiet. Snow absorbs sound and thick walls swallow what remains. Conversations grow shorter, more functional. Laughter still happens, but it arrives suddenly and disappears just as fast, like warmth from a single log tossed on the fire. Silence settles heavily, pressing inward. A quirky detail emerges in how people fight this mental stagnation. Stories are repeated, not because they're new, but because repetition itself is grounding. You hear the same tale told 3 nights in a row, each time with slight variation. Familiarity becomes comfort. Predictability becomes safety. Sleep patterns fracture further. People wake in the night not just from cold, but from restless thoughts. You lie awake listening to wind, imagining worst-case futures. Will the food last? Will the roof hold? Will the thaw come before someone else falls ill? Anxiety becomes a background hum, constant but rarely spoken. There's scholarly debate about how medieval people conceptualize mental distress. Some historians argue psychological suffering was expressed primarily through physical symptoms: fatigue, aches, melancholy. Others suggest people were keenly aware of despair but framed it spiritually rather than medically. Living through this winter, you sense both. Sadness exists, but it's absorbed into routine, prayer, and labour. A fringe belief surfaces that despair itself invites death. Giving up is seen as dangerous, almost contagious. So people perform resilience even when they don't feel it. They keep moving, keep talking, keep tending fires. Hope becomes a behaviour, not an emotion. Children feel the weight too. You notice their questions change. Less curiosity, more reassurance seeking. When will it end? Are we safe? Adults answer carefully, balancing honesty with calm. Fear must be managed, especially in the young, whose morale affects everyone else. You also see how boredom becomes its own challenge. With movement restricted and work limited, minds turn inward. Old grievances resurface. Minor irritations feel larger. Winter tests patience as much as endurance. Disputes are settled quickly or avoided entirely, because conflict drains energy no one can spare. Religion plays a stabilizing role here, regardless of personal belief. Prayer punctuates time, marking hours when the sun cannot. Bells, when they can be rung, anchor days in sound. Ritual replaces lost structure, giving shape to endless nights. You feel how hope is rationed like fuel. People don't speak of spring constantly. That risks disappointment. Instead, they focus on the next meal, the next morning, the next small task. Short horizons protect the mind from breaking under long uncertainty. Memory becomes selective. You forget what warmth feels like. You forget colours beyond grey and firelight orange. This narrowing of experience is unsettling, but adaptive. The world simplifies to what matters: heat, food, people. You notice moments of unexpected tenderness, a hand squeezed during a story, a shared smile when the fire catches quickly. These small connections glow brightly against the monotony. Winter amplifies them. As days pass, you understand that medieval survival during deadly blizzards is as much psychological as physical. The body endures cold, the mind endures repetition, isolation, and uncertainty. Both must hold. When the storm finally pauses and light brightens the room just a little more than yesterday, the relief feels disproportionate. It's not warmth yet, but it's difference. And difference is enough to keep hope alive. You sit there watching shadows shorten by the smallest margin, realizing that endurance isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet persistence. It's waking up again. It's telling the same story one more time. And in the long medieval winter, that quiet persistence is what carries people through the dark. By now you understand a hard truth that settles in slowly. Medieval winter survival is not about being warm. It's about being less cold than yesterday. Comfort, as you know it, simply doesn't exist here. People don't aim for ease or relief, they aim for thresholds. Not freezing, not starving, not giving in. A solid historical fact reinforces this perspective. Medieval accounts rarely describe winter life in terms of comfort. Instead, records focus on endurance, how long stores lasted, how many survived, how much damage was done. Warmth was not an expectation, it was an occasional bonus. You feel this mindset everywhere. When someone manages to dry their shoes fully, it's a small victory. When the fire lasts all night without dying, it's quietly celebrated. These moments don't bring joy so much as relief. Survival becomes a series of modest successes stacked carefully together. A quirky detail emerges in how people talk about warmth. They don't say, "I'm warm," they say, "It's not so bad," or "I can feel my hands again." Language reflects limits. Absolute comfort is unimaginable, but relative improvement is meaningful. There's scholarly debate about whether medieval people experienced cold differently due to acclimatization. Some argue constant exposure lowered discomfort thresholds. Others counter that suffering was simply normalized, not reduced. Sitting here, wrapped in wool but still chilled, you suspect normalization plays a larger role. People don't feel less cold, they just expect it. This expectation shapes emotional response. Complaining is rare, not because people don't feel pain, but because voicing it changes nothing. Silence becomes efficiency. Energy is conserved not just physically, but emotionally. You notice how architecture, clothing, food, and routine all align toward this same principle. Nothing is designed to create comfort, only to reduce harm. Houses don't invite relaxation. They block wind. Clothes don't feel soft. They insulate. Food doesn't delight. It fuels. A fringe belief lingers that seeking comfort too openly weakens character. Endurance is admired. Softness is suspect. Winter reinforces this value system relentlessly, rewarding restraint and punishing excess. Even moments of warmth carry caution. A fire burning too high risks consuming tomorrow's fuel. Extra blankets might be saved for someone weaker. Comfort is temporary, conditional, shared carefully. You also realize how this mindset reshapes memory. People don't remember winters as cozy or miserable. They remember whether they survived. Detail fades. Outcome remains. "We got through it" becomes the summary. Children absorb this early. You see them learning not to expect ease, not to ask for warmth that doesn't exist. Their resilience is not taught. It's modelled, repeated daily until it becomes normal. Yet this absence of comfort doesn't mean absence of care. On the contrary, care becomes more intentional. When comfort can't be provided broadly, it's offered precisely. An extra blanket here, a warmer seat there, a larger portion for someone faltering. As you sit by the hearth, hands close but not too close to the embers, you feel how survival without heating demands constant calibration. Too close and you burn. Too far and you numb. Balance is everything. You understand now that medieval winter life operates on margins. The goal is not to feel good, it's to stay functional. Comfort would be wasteful. Survival is enough. And in that realization, something shifts. You stop longing for warmth and start valuing stability. The fire burns steadily. The food holds out another day. Everyone wakes up. In medieval England's deadly blizzards, that is what success looks like. Not comfort, not relief. Just one more day held together by restraint, cooperation, and the quiet discipline of enduring what cannot be changed. By the time winter begins to loosen its grip, you realize it has already done its work, not just on bodies and buildings, but on expectations. Survival has quietly reshaped what matters. You don't think in terms of comfort anymore. You think in terms of continuity, of keeping the fragile thread unbroken until spring arrives. A firm historical fact anchors this realization. Medieval communities that survived repeated harsh winters developed long-term adaptations, thicker clothing traditions, improved food storage, architectural tweaks, and stronger communal norms. Winter was not just endured, it was studied through experience, its lessons absorbed slowly and passed on. You see this knowledge everywhere now, in how fires are built lower but steadier, in how children are taught early to layer, to move, to listen to wind, in how stores are replenished not to abundance, but to sufficiency. Survival becomes institutional memory. A quirky detail stands out in how people talk about spring. They don't romanticize it. There's no dramatic anticipation. Instead, there's cautious hope. Early thaws can be dangerous. Floods, sickness, spoiled food. Winter teaches skepticism. Relief must be managed as carefully as cold. There's scholarly debate about whether medieval resilience was conscious or accidental. Some historians argue people deliberately refined survival strategies. Others suggest adaptation emerged unconsciously through trial and loss. Sitting here, you sense intention woven through habit. People remember what worked. They don't repeat what failed. You notice how winter reshapes social bonds permanently. Those who shared warmth and food carry that connection forward. Trust deepens. Debts are remembered, but so are kindnesses. Survival knits people together in ways summer never quite replicates. A fringe belief lingers that surviving a harsh winter earns protection against the next. It's not logical, but it's comforting. Each endured season adds weight to identity. We are winter people, someone says, not proudly but steadily. You also feel how winter leaves scars. Lost animals, burned furniture, empty storage bins. Survival has a cost. Recovery will take months, sometimes years, but loss is not viewed as failure. Death is mourned, but survival is respected. Both are acknowledged without illusion. As snow melts, movement returns cautiously. Roads reappear, trade resumes slowly, but winter's lessons remain active. Fires are still watched. Food is still rationed. People don't immediately trust warmth. Cold has taught them patience. You realise that medieval survival during deadly blizzards wasn't built on one great innovation or heroic act. It was built on thousands of small, disciplined choices made daily. How close to sit to the fire, when to eat, who sleeps where, when to wait. Without heating, people learned to live inside limits rather than fight them. They accepted cold as a constant presence, negotiated with it, and refused to let it dictate the end. Endurance became culture. As you sit watching the light linger a little longer than yesterday, you understand the final lesson winter teaches. Survival is rarely dramatic. It's quiet, repetitive, and deeply human. People survived medieval blizzards not because they were stronger than you, but because they adjusted what they expected from life. They didn't need warmth. They needed enough. And in that enough fire, enough food, enough care, they carried themselves through the cold year after year until spring returned. As the season finally exhales, everything softens. The wind loses its edge. Snow retreats into shadowed corners. You don't rush this moment, because winter has taught you to move slowly, to notice small changes. The fire still burns, but lower now. It no longer feels like a lifeline, just a companion. You reflect on how people lived through deadly blizzards without heating, not by defeating cold, but by understanding it, by shaping homes, habits, and relationships around the reality that warmth was precious and never guaranteed. Survival was shared, endurance was learned, comfort was optional. These people didn't have thermostats or forecasts, but they had memory, cooperation, and restraint. They knew when to act and when to wait. They knew that winter always takes something, but not everything. As your breathing slows and the story settles, let the quiet resilience of medieval England linger with you. The crackle of embers, the weight of wool, the steady presence of others nearby. You don't need to survive that winter tonight. You only need to rest.